We're looking here at a topographical map of Kent from 1769. And the map makers make a point of saying that this is from an actual survey, because up to that point, mapping techniques had not been terribly scientific. But by the end of the 18th century, the Ordnance Survey would be well underway. And Kent was one of the first, if not the first county to be mapped, being of such strategic importance. This is after the 7 Years' War in 1769. Very important to know your territory.
Wow.
So there's Kent.
Yep. And there's Canterbury and Dover.
Yeah. So still of strategic importance in its own way. So what we're looking at is, by one account, the Garden of England. And by another account, clearly what we're looking at is border territory.
Yep.
And so we're looking at Canterbury, we're looking at West Kent, but what we're also looking at is Dover, and what we can't see is Calais. And obviously Dover and Calais are sites of important movement and traffic right now. So the Refugee Tales project started in Dover, and it followed a walk through Kent. The reason it started in Dover is that until very recently there was an immigration removal centre in Dover. The point of the immigration removal centre is to detain people and in practice to detain people indefinitely until such time as it's possible to deport them from the government's point of view. The Refugee Tales project started in response to the fact that the UK is the only country in Europe that detains people indefinitely. So what we were looking to do was both to tell stories, the stories of people who had been detained, but also to, in one way or another, to reimagine and in some ways reclaim and reoccupy a space that has been characterised in purely and exclusively and quite aggressively English terms. So we wanted to kind of plot a route across Canterbury. It was a very mixed group of walkers, some people whose rights of residence isn't under question, but some people who had themselves been detained and whose residence is under question. And we were following a Chaucerian model in that everywhere we stopped, we told a pair of tales. And the tales were the tales of people who had been detained, people who sought refuge in this country and found themselves detained, and then also people who worked with them. You're actually involved in that a little bit, weren't you?
I was involved in that. I gave a talk at Shepherd's Well the first year and one at Faversham the second year, joining up the whole medieval literary side with what you were doing in Refugee Tales.
There are connections across the Channel, but there are also connections all the way to the Mediterranean and further east, aren't there, as well as west to the New World.
Yeah. I mean, as a medievalist, obviously this kind of track through Canterbury to Dover is really important because this is the start of the great pilgrimage route that takes you to Rome and then subsequently to Jerusalem. What really interests me is the Christian pilgrims going to Jerusalem, and the place that I'm working on at the moment is actually Cyprus, which is the very end of Europe, is the end of Christianity before people go off into the Holy Land, which is ruled by the Muslims, to visit the holy places there. And what we have is a whole series of pilgrim accounts of their journeying, because as there wasn't the mapping and surveying that you've got somewhere like this, people, when they made those long journeys, wrote quite detailed accounts so that people following after knew where to go, knew the places where they could ask for advice, the places to stop, and so on. So
A Lonely Planet.
Absolutely. It's
for medieval and early modern travelers.
It's a kind of Lonely Planet guide for people taking that same trip. Yeah. And you also, of course, end up in the Middle East.
Yes, I ended up in the Middle East, having walked and also written about how walking and hunting were both ways of learning ecological thinking, again, beginning in the long 18th century. I found that so many of the influences upon horse culture, equestrian culture in Britain actually came from the Ottoman Empire. Not only the horses themselves, but also ideas about human-animal relations. So I became more and more interested in Ottoman travelers and ended up with an Ottoman historian and some other historians and literary people retracing an Ottoman traveler. He had been a courtier and he'd often been in the service of the court and the military, but when he came to make the Hajj, his pilgrimage to Mecca, he was free to go anywhere and slowly and stopping at as many places as he wanted.
Yeah.
So we decided to retrace that section of his pilgrimage route, which is more or less lying between Istanbul and Izmir, but off the beaten track. You find amazing, wonderful villages where people are still practicing organic farming and in some cases using horses, mules and donkeys in their agriculture, and producing wonderful fruits and vegetables and so on. But his route turned out to be actually remarkably accurate. This is Evliya Çelebi, who was a 17th century Ottoman traveller and wrote a 10-volume manuscript of his travels.
Wonderful, wonderful.
So writing and riding,
Yes,
because he loved
exactly.
horses, horses were the key, went very well together for him.
Yeah.
So what we became interested in was how the act of walking itself alters both the talk and the writing that takes place in relation to the project. So it was always carefully plotted where we would stop and where the stories would be told. But what we really hadn't anticipated was what it would mean to move through territory that we thought we were familiar with, but we weren't, in the company of people who had been in the country, in many cases, for a long time, 10, 15 years in some cases, who themselves had never really had the kind of freedom of movement in this country that allowed them to make a journey like that across the English countryside. And then, in that process, to hear the degree to which they were unfamiliar with the territory, but also how they were interested in the territory, and then to factor that into our own thinking. And so the whole act of talking became an act of sharing stories. And the landscape itself alters, and your sense of the landscape alters when you walk through it with people who have a different relation to it. It's a straightforward fact, but it's a really decisive fact, I think.
Yeah. That's really interesting, thinking about my pilgrims going through Cyprus, who are not just seeing it as somewhere en route to their final destination.
Yeah.
They are really, really interested in the land,
Yeah.
in how it operates, in how the people carry out their daily lives, what they look like, how they dress, what they eat.
Yeah.
Lots of comments about the immensely strong wine of Cyprus, which I obviously enjoyed quite a lot. So there is that kind of ethnographic kind of impulse going on as well, very much. And it's interesting you talking about what you have done with refugee tales and people walking through the landscape today who maybe haven't always been free to do that. Because, of course, what we see in Cyprus, recreating the pilgrim routes there, is that they cross over the green line, the UN partition zone, which today separates northern and southern Cyprus. So it speaks back to a time before that division was in place, which suddenly stopped people moving around.
Yes, yes. I mean, so we have a point of division here in Dover. So obviously that's a border and a frontier. But what we were also very aware of is that we were walking in the wake of the development of the recent immigration bill, which became an Immigration Act. The express intention of which was to make the UK, quote unquote, a hostile environment for what was called illegal immigration. So what we were very keen to do was to take a journey through Kent, which made that environment not hostile but welcoming. And so one of the things we were trying to do along the way was work out what it might mean in a moment of very hostile public discourse to try and develop a discourse that is not as hostile as that is intending to be.
In which the countryside becomes a place of amenities and hospitality.
And refuge.
And refuge.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely, yeah. So one of the questions that came up as we were planning and developing Refugee Tales is exactly kind of what is the mode of writing that is best placed to do the kind of witness work that we're talking about. And there are all kinds of complications in the situation that I've been describing. So the people who have been detained, whose experience is that we're trying to capture and relay and communicate and make known, are often compromised in various different ways. One of those ways is that in making the journey that they have to this country and then having had the experience that they've had in this country, they are quite seriously traumatized and troubled. And whilst they want their story to be told, they don't always want to be the person who does the telling of the story, especially not in public. Yeah. But then there's another consideration, which is that people in that circumstance, so people whose asylum cases are not resolved, they are at permanent and constant risk of being re-detained. So there's a question of confidentiality and anonymity that we have to observe. So then so what we did, also kind of observing the Chaucerian model, is we paired writers with the person whose story was being told. And one of the things that we liked about the Canterbury Tales as a model is that people aren't telling their own tales, they're telling the tales of other people. So it's and it seems like it's kind of counterintuitive. You would think always that a person should tell their own tale, and obviously there are many ways in which a person should tell their own tale, but there are these other models. And then the question that arises for the writers who are involved in the project is, well, really, how do you do that? Do you simply tell the story as it is told to you in an exactly verbatim way, or do you acknowledge that you are a participant in this storytelling, and then do you kind of respond to that in some stylistic way that is your own? So what we were trying to do as we were kind of mapping the territory and walking across was also work out what it means to bring these stories into the language and try and kind of get them across.
That's really interesting, thinking about the Canterbury Tales and the way that the tale tellers tell a story, which is invariably pretty much a pre-existing story, but very often really interestingly reworked.
Yeah.
And often these are stories that are quite widespread in medieval culture generally.
Yeah.
But what Chaucer gets his tellers to do with them actually tend to reflect back then on the teller. And you
Yes.
start to be able to ask questions about the veracity of the teller, their good faith, whatever
Yes.
it might be. So that's a really interesting kind of dynamic that you've picked up on.
Yeah, and it's a kind of so it means there's a sharing of tales going on, and there's a kind of reciprocity. So in the act of developing the tale, then a kind of learning takes place in both directions, in every possible direction. So the writers who were involved in our project, who were from various different backgrounds, many of them, at least half of them, were themselves from migrant backgrounds. They were often observing about the telling of the tale that the language felt different to them because they had been involved in this process.
Right.
So when you're actually involved in a process of listening to another person's tale of a journey, and then you're actually journeying with them, as we were in the project, then everything alters.
Yeah.
It's not just that a tale is told, but that everything around the tale alters.
So, Donna, who is your writer writing for? Who is he telling his story to?
He seems to have an imaginary Ottoman audience because he's often anticipating how more pious people who are more pious than he is, although he is himself a pious Muslim, he's a Hafez, he recites the Quran. That's one of his official jobs. He's also a dervish, a Sufi dervish. But nevertheless, he's the kind of dervish, as he says, who keeps servants, rides horses, and goes out among people, as opposed to a cloistered one. So he's a gentleman dervish. And when he's addressing his Ottoman audience, he's often telling them, this is the custom of people. For example, the Albanians like to get drunk and go walking in the streets with their beloveds, who are often beautiful boys. And he says, this is their custom, so we must not censure it.
Yeah.
And the way he
That's
says we must
interesting.
not
That's
censure it is by
fantastic,
saying, this is no disgrace.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Interesting. Really
So in that sense, he did have an audience. His manuscript languished in Cairo after he died and was only brought back to Istanbul later in the 18th century by an from the Harem, one of the chief eunuchs who had a Cairo connection, brought the manuscript back to Istanbul. And it wasn't really discovered until the 19th century. So in a way, you could say he was ahead of his time, although we also know that he did make reports along the way. So some of what the notes and things he made, he would have been telling to his audiences, which were both urban in Cairo and Istanbul, and very rural as he went everywhere. The thing about Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is that actually the 1001 Nights and the kinds of stories that were told in the bazaars throughout the Middle East that feed into that, in which stories are sometimes a matter of life and death, is again not unconnected to the stories that are being told here along the way.
And stories are a matter of life and death. So how a story gets told by a modern traveller, especially a person who's been compelled to leave a place, how that story gets told can have great bearing on how they're received. And it's not just that the story itself can have has great bearing. The telling of the story has great bearing, but how it's heard, whether it's believed, whether it's interrupted, whether it's thwarted, all of those conditions still apply, don't they? Clearly.